Well, welcome everyone to episode 29 of EV Society's Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar. In recent episodes of our webinar, we've heard from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association about the transition to electric cars. Close to half of the vehicles in Canada, depending on where you draw the line, fall into the category of imports. And so today we'll be hearing about the opportunities and the challenges of electrification for this very important auto sector. Jason Arnaud is back with us once again to manage your questions and to pose them to our guest speaker following his presentation. Remember to upvote questions that you see there from others that you also wish to have answered. And as usual, we respect your time with us, and we will end today's broadcast no later than 8:30. Today, we welcome David C. Adams, President and CEO of Global Automakers of Canada, to the webinar. GAC, as it's known, is the National Trade Association representing the Canadian interests of 15 of the world's most respected automakers. David has more than 30 years of experience in the Canadian automotive industry and is the only individual to have served executive roles with both of Canada's leading automotive industry associations. David has been at the forefront of the association's work surrounding the disruption and evolution of the automotive industry in Canada, including zero-emission vehicles and their adoption, as well as the regulatory environment necessary to support the adoption of automated and connected vehicles. And that's a topic that we'd like to tackle one day specifically. David is the current chair of the Canadian Motor Vehicle Arbitration Plan, a national consumer dispute resolution program, and was involved in the creation of the National Automobile Dealer Arbitration Program for disputes arising between dealers and manufacturers. He also serves on the boards of the Automotive Business School of Canada and the Traffic Injury Research Foundation. And as if all of that wasn't enough to keep him busy, David also hosts the association's podcast, From Here to Where, on the future of the automotive industry in Canada. He is a regular columnist in Canadian Auto Dealer, writing a regular column called The Big Picture. So we welcome David. Welcome to the webinar.
Thanks very much for having me, Tim. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's going to be great. We really look forward to hearing more about the opportunities and the challenges that your association and your members face as we sort of go through this amazing transition to electrification. So I'm going to get out of your way and let you take the floor.
Okay, terrific. Well, thanks very much again, Tim, and I appreciate the opportunity to present before the EV Society today. I've been following the work of the EV Society for some time. Having the opportunity to drive a number of different vehicles in the role that I'm in. I had a Audi e-tron for a year or so, and I experienced all the pleasures and the challenges, I guess, that arise from owning an EV, and especially an EV where I only have on-street parking and don't have a garage or anywhere to charge the vehicle at my home. Just to give you a little bit more background on the association that I represent, we do have 15 members, as Tim alluded to. Two of our members actually produce vehicles in Canada, Honda and Toyota. And Toyota, for the last number of years, has been the largest vehicle manufacturer in Canada, followed closely, at least maybe not last year, but the year before that, by Honda. So the transplants, as they've traditionally been called, have really stepped up and become a major force in vehicle production in Canada. So two companies that manufacture here in Canada, and the remainder of our members from Japan, Korea, and Europe, distributing and servicing vehicles in Canada. The topic that I wanted to chat with you a little bit about today was the challenges and opportunities of the transition ahead. And if I can get my slides to advance, there we go. We can talk a little bit about that. I guess just for some context setting, I think it's always important with respect to any transition to remember Bill Gates' quote that people often overestimate what will happen in the next 2 years and underestimate what will happen in the next 10. And from my perspective, I've always looked at the transition to electrified vehicles through that same lens, and that I think the activity will probably happen quicker than those of us in the automotive industry think it will, and may happen much less quickly than perhaps some in the environmental community hope it will. But with that, I think I wanted to just chat to you about what transition are we actually talking about. And I think, as most of you know, the automotive industry is going through a fundamental transition and fundamental disruption, actually, on a number of different fronts, propulsion being just one of them. There's also the whole trend to digitize the entire spectrum of the automotive business, automated and connected vehicles, as Tim alluded to in the introduction, and transportation as a service as well. So all of these disruptive factors are happening to the automotive industry all at one time, and all of which require billions of dollars to execute. But the transition that we wanted to focus on tonight, or that I want to focus on tonight, is the transition to propulsion and what opportunities and challenges exist in that arena. Again, for a bit of context setting, I wanted to put this slide up. It's obviously not comprehensive, but it has an indication of a number of different vehicle manufacturers from around the world, some of the goals and targets that they've set for both the electrification of their vehicle fleet, and also in the orange, their commitments to being carbon neutral companies, rather, or having 100% zero emission vehicles on the road. So all that to say is that I think sometimes automakers are viewed as going kicking and screaming down this path towards propulsion transition or GHG emissions reduction. But I think the reality is that there's emerged a global consensus that something does need to be done about greenhouse gas emissions. And I think all of our member companies, and really all companies in the automotive industry, are trying to be responsible corporate citizens and looking at how they can walk towards that goal. In the context of the transition, I guess, what is the ultimate objective? And there's 3 circles that I've put on this slide, and I think they're all relevant in their own way. From our perspective, again, in keeping with the last slide and my comments there, I think in the automotive industry, we believe that the overall objective is GHG emissions reduction arising from this transition. So the transition to pure battery electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles, and when I say zero emission vehicles, I would include plug-in hybrids along with fuel cell vehicles. Those technologies are one suite of options, certainly, to allow us to achieve the overall objective of GHG emissions reduction from light duty vehicle transportation. Not the only mechanism, but certainly an important one. And then there's another objective that is often tied in with this transition as well, and that's economic development. And I think from the perspective of the manufacturers here in Canada and the Canadian government and the provincial governments, that is sometimes seen as often an equal or more important objective in some cases, even though I don't think anybody would ever admit it, as greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Because I think the reality is, if you look at our automotive industry in Canada, unless we make that transition to electrified vehicles, whether that's hybrid vehicles as a transition to plug-in hybrid vehicles or pure electric vehicles, we're going to be left behind, given the commitments that have been made, or the global consensus that's been noted at the outset of my comments about no more internal combustion engines sold beyond 2035. So certainly that has implications for our supply chain, which we'll touch on a little bit. the new supply chain, which we have to develop, and the combination of our mining sector and our automotive sector in a way that we probably never undertaken before. So I think each one of those circles, sometimes they all intersect, and sometimes they intersect from time to time with one another. But again, from our perspective, the overriding goal as automakers is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I guess a challenge, and you'll see these slides are sort of noted with titles, opportunities and challenges, but I've just picked up Quebec's emission summary for the purposes of edification. Quebec, as you know, has had the longest zero emission vehicle mandate in place in Canada, which went into force, I believe, in 2018. And you can see if the objective of a ZEV mandate is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's not been entirely the results that we've achieved based on the emissions profile that I've circled here on this particular slide. You'll see that overall maybe our emissions have come down in Quebec from light duty gas vehicles, but they've gone up from light duty trucks from 2018 to 2019. And obviously 2020 is a bit of an anomaly given the severe impact of COVID on vehicle sales and vehicle use as well. So it's probably not pertinent to compare emissions there. But I mean, when we look at this and it, I can look at it through the economic development lens, hearkening back to the previous slide, that from Quebec's perspective, their electricity generation is virtually all emissions free. From their perspective, it makes sense to look at electrifying not only transportation, but many other things in their province. But I think we just need to be honest that that's probably the overriding goal in Quebec of the transition is economic development and getting off of oil and utilizing their natural resources that they have in terms of clean electricity, with perhaps climate change being a secondary factor, even though, as I say, you probably never get any politician to admit that. I guess when we look at the ingredients for success for this transition, probably not have all of them here, but I think these are some critical ones. Obviously vehicle supply is an issue. That's one that's often raised in terms of any discussion that we might have on this issue. Vehicle affordability is a key factor. I think everyone is aware that EVs still cost significantly more in some cases than ICE vehicles, and the proposition is that you'll save money over the total time that you own your vehicle, the total cost of ownership, and when you look at the reduced maintenance costs factor into that as well. Cultivating our own supply chain with respect to battery development and raw materials. We've all seen a number of announcements on both of those things, I think, over the course of the last year, especially. Some of those major, for instance, Stellantis's and LG's announcement down in Windsor of the the $5 billion investment, the largest investment ever made in Canadian automotive history, to produce batteries down in Windsor. Charging infrastructure, as some view it as a complementary measure. I think in the auto industry's view, we would see that as a precursor, a necessary precursor to spur the consumer adoption of zero emission vehicles. Clearly, if you can't charge your vehicles or don't have confidence that you can charge your vehicle, that becomes a major problem. And countless surveys have identified that that's indeed a key issue on the minds of a number of consumers. Supply chain development, that's something that we're having to create as we go along, and something like most of the things here we need to capitalize on quickly if we're going to be successful in that regard. Electricity distribution, electricity generation, obviously there are huge concerns there in terms of as we move out to beyond 2030 and look at being net zero by 2050. That's going to require the broader electrification of society, not just our vehicles. And then as far as vehicles are concerned, consumer demand is a critical factor as well. So we'll touch on maybe a few of these as we move forward. My intention is not to go in depth through all of these, because we'll be here for a few hours instead of just under one. But I wanted to just talk briefly about some of these factors. I think this slide, I just wanted to maybe highlight what automakers have some control over. We do have control over vehicle supply, and a little bit of control over the supply chain development, and a little bit of control over vehicle affordability. But to a large extent, most of these things are outside of our control. And I think even where we have primary control over these factors, vehicle supply, I think, I'm happy to talk about it in the questions, but I'm not going to get into the whole issue of zero emission vehicle mandates, sort of one way or the other, but only to say that, I think from the perspective of putting or wanting a mandate because it will guarantee supply is a bit, from my perspective, a little bit misguided, and I think doesn't fully comprehend the fact that we are talking about, sort of rebuilding the whole supply chain and kind of rebuilding the industry for zero emission vehicles. And, this means that we have to retrofit plants. We have to bring new plants up to speed. We have to, again, develop the supply chain noted below, and we have to also build the facilities with our partners, the battery manufacturers, to supply the new propulsion source for those vehicles. So all of these things take time. They take massive amounts of investment, and they take massive amounts of cooperation and coordination. It will take time for EVs to come to market. And while some might not wish to talk about it, I think, as I indicated in one of my first slides, all of these different transitions going through the disruption of the industry require significant amounts of money. So companies need to be profitable in order to make this transition. And some of the realities arising from that transition that may be driven by mandates, take us down the road of unintended consequences, which we can perhaps get into afterwards. But I think that's really all I wanted to say on the vehicle supply issue right now. I think if we look at, well, what are some of the opportunities then if we look at the supply chain for Canada? And this is, again, for somebody like myself that's been around the industry for a while, this is a whole new aspect to our industry that we haven't necessarily had to deal with before. So the whole mining side of the industry and building up that whole supply chain, as I alluded to before. I mean, if we look at the demand that EVs are going to place on certain raw materials, it's huge in terms of 9 times more copper by 2030, 9 times more lithium by 2030, nickel 14 times more than we have in production right at the moment, cobalt 3 times more, carbon 10 times more. But I think the demand is there, and that's certainly an opportunity for Canada. But the high demand, for example, lithium carbonate has already seen the cost of batteries increase 40 to 60% over the last 2 years. So I think the notion that batteries are going to keep coming down, battery prices are going to keep on coming down that cost curve at an accelerated level is a bit of an illusion at the moment. And from our perspective, price parity is going to be a little bit further down the road. Again, this is a bit of an eye test, but again, it looks at the opportunities that exist for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper because of the excess demand that's arising from from EVs, but the reality is that we don't have enough capacity, or are going to be out of capacity in most of these substances. If you look at it around the 2026 in some cases time frame and whatnot, so it creates a huge opportunity, but I think also a big challenge in terms of how are we going to meet that demand, and who is going to meet it. And I think who is going to meet it represents an opportunity for Canada, because I've often heard many people say, well, Canada has all of the ingredients to be an EV and a battery superpower. And when you look at this this map of Canada, which has been cribbed from the 22 federal budget, it does look like Canada has a lot of the mines, the smelters and refineries for the key minerals that are part and parcel of battery electric vehicles. I think that the challenge is that we have to figure out a way to mine these minerals in a way that is both sustainable and also done in a manner that that's expedited as well, if we really wish to take advantage of the opportunity of being able to turn Canada into that battery or EV superpower that I think many are hoping it will be. And when you contemplate that it takes maybe 15 to 20 years to bring a new mine on board, and you also appreciate the fact that battery chemistries are evolving very rapidly, it's not out of the question to look at a situation where you could spend a lot of time and money expediting roads and bringing mines on stream, perhaps only to realize that things have moved on and we're on to different and better battery chemistry. So it's an area where there's a significant amount of, I think, risk and due diligence that needs to be undertaken with a lot of these projects to ensure that they're viable and they will meet the demand ahead. I think in terms of looking at other opportunities, bear with me, I'm struggling with a bit of a cold, so I'm going to take a bit of a sip of water here. If we look at some of the other opportunities, especially in Ontario, and this is a slide from Owen and from the Ontario Ministry of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade. I think it highlights some of the real advantages that certainly Southern Ontario has, and Northern Ontario even as well. When we look at the various clusters that we have in effect, we have an automotive minerals cluster, an IT and a technology cluster, which is really, I think the second largest cluster in North America, first being down in Silicon Valley in California. We've got an auto manufacturing cluster, which is, again, second in North American assembly. And, between those two clusters, I think we're unique in all of North America. And then the other advantage that Ontario has is that we've got a financial services cluster as well. That is also overlapping a number of those other clusters too, which all, again, on paper looks like Canada, and in particular, Ontario, have the right elements to be able to leverage this transition to electrified vehicles. Okay, let's see if I can get my slides to advance here. Bear with me. There we go. This particular slide is from NextGen that undertook a significant study of what it's going to take and what it will mean for Canada to make this transition to electrified vehicles. And one of the things that maybe folks aren't really aware of is that the the 600 odd part suppliers in Ontario, most of their revenue and most of the plants that are in business really are, and maybe makes perfect sense given where we're at in the production of vehicles in Southern Ontario and Canada. They're really part suppliers for the internal combustion engine vehicle. And, you know, you look particularly at the number of plants and the associated revenue as well for engine and transmission components. And it's significant. And I think if you look on the other side, on the right side of the slide at the EV part suppliers, we're pretty sparse in terms of the number of plants and revenue associated with the with those plants. So this is really a two-pronged challenge. One is being able to transition those suppliers that can make the transition, given their skill set and what they're producing now for internal combustion engine vehicles, to transition over to producing parts and components for the zero emission vehicle industry. That's one transition. And the other transition is really working with those companies that will not be able to make that transition and ensuring that their workers, businesses, what have you, are achieve some sort of soft landing or rising from this transition as it moves forward. So there's I think a lot of work to be done in terms of building out our supply chain from a part supplier base, and also a lot of work to be done to be contemplating the transition of a significant number of employees that would be affected by this transition to zero emission vehicles as well. Another one of our challenges, and RBC, as a lot of you I'm sure are aware, has taken a look at the issue of energy and energy required to meet the transition to net zero by 2050. And just in terms of looking, I mean, everything seems to have gaps here in terms of what the existing and expected capacity is, for whether it's electricity or lithium or what have you, and what the demand is going to be. So Canada really needs to essentially almost double its grid capacity by 2050, and that will not come cheaply either. I think RBC has been talking about close to $2 trillion to make this transition to, and it's not all, mind you, electricity generation, but $2 trillion to make the transition to net zero by 2050. But I think they've been looking at about 1.5 trillion required for bringing on new electricity generation, and also the grid distribution or the electricity distribution as well. And all that to say is that according to RBC, electricity rates could rise by 30%, but there's an expectation that may be offset by increased efficiency and the ways we heat our home and that sort of thing. But again, the challenge that exists is that when we're one of the advantages of purchasing a zero emission vehicle for a consumer beyond altruistic reasons of doing something right for the environment is to save money. And when you see electricity rates starting to go up, then I think that does impact the total cost of ownership equation as you move forward as well. So these are things that we're all going to have to keep our eye on as we move forward through the transition as well. There are, I think, some other important exogenous factors, I guess, as I would call them, that are also going to impact into this mix as well. We're all have seen evidence of a softening economy, and we've certainly seen evidence, if not experienced the impact of higher interest rates for our mortgages or when you go to purchase a vehicle. We've seen inflation at 40-year highs, geopolitical issues, whether that's the war in Ukraine that many people couldn't foresee a year or so ago, and then trade measures, whether those are trade measures with our our friends and perhaps our largest friend, the United States, or other trade measures. And we can look at some of those a little bit as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess, one trade measure that could have significantly impacted the Canadian automotive manufacturing industry as far as making that transition to zero emission vehicles, and that's the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. Many of you are probably aware of the provisions of that act. The upside for Canada is that it removed the, I guess, what you would call the Buy America provisions associated with the original incentive proposal, which would have only given incentives to, or the full amount of the incentive to, vehicles that were built in the United States, and other provisos had with union labor as well, which would have been problematic for my member companies. But what the Inflation Reduction Act did do is remove the existing sales caps. Each company had a sales cap of 200,000 units. So those sales caps are gone. So that's good news, I suppose, for Tesla and for General Motors. But the IRA did add MSRP caps as well. So only vehicles that are cars that are $55,000 and under, and trucks that are $80,000 or under, are eligible for the tax credit. And then also income testing was added as well. And some of you may be aware that BC is putting in place income testing for their EV incentive eligibility as well, but at much lower levels than what's been contemplated here, especially remembering that these are US dollars. And just a sidebar on that, my own perspective, I think the perspective of our members is that the income testing measures will not actually assist in buttressing EV uptake, but rather could, at least in the short term, have a negative effect on EV uptake. The key criteria, as I mentioned at the outset for the IRA, was the fact that the vehicle must now be assembled in North America, not just the US. But it does have an escalating stringency for North American critical minerals and battery content, and those percentages are in the yellow chart at the right-hand side of the screen. And I think by and large, there's essentially an agreement that those targets are going to be difficult, if not impossible, to meet in the short term. And probably the more critical component is the very last one that I'm calling it the China content caveat, but it's foreign entities of concern, I think is how it's referred to in the IRA. But really, if any battery or critical mineral that comes from a foreign entity of concern, they wouldn't be eligible for the incentive after December 31st for components, or critical materials December 31st, 2024. That's not a long time, and especially when you consider that most of our supply chain comes from China, it's going to very much limit the applicability of the tax credit to EVs in the United States. I guess other challenges, I mean, we're expecting, I think, that there's going to be a recession in Canada, sort of expecting that would be sometime starting, I guess, this fourth quarter here. And some expectations of that I've heard have been that would run through the Q2 of 2023. There's an estimated 2% drop in GDP. And I guess by historical terms, that would be deemed to be a relatively mild recession, as the recession medium has been about a 4% drop in GDP if you look back from 1980 to 2019. But I think Canadians are at greater risk than perhaps folks in the US who've learned from the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. We tend to be much more over leveraged than US consumers are now, with debt loads that are about 110% of earnings. If we look at other challenges, we're looking at essentially 40-year high inflation, and that has come down a little bit recently, but certainly well beyond the 1.5 to sort of 2.5% band that the Bank of Canada likes to strive for. And inflation is making everything more expensive and certainly cutting into people's ability to purchase vehicles, which are becoming increasingly expensive as well. When you look at the average price of a vehicle in Canada is now about $50,000, which is up considerably from, I think, around $32,000 or $33,000, which it was only about 2 or 3 years ago. And then we also look at interest rates. And again, no surprise to anybody, the Bank of Canada has been on a march to increase interest rates to try and tame inflation. A Bank of Canada rate now is sitting at 3.25%. That's being reflected in borrowing costs from everything from homes to vehicles. So these two things are having a negative impact on starting to have a negative impact on the automotive industry generally, and I think EV sales specifically. I saw this tweet on Twitter the other day, and I thought, well, it kind of sums everything up. That somebody ordered a new electric BMW. They had to wait 14 months for the vehicle, 60 days from delivery. The interest rate on the lease has gone up, and to boot, the federal government has put in a 10% luxury tax as well. And I think most of you are probably aware, despite intense lobbying from the automotive industry and others, the federal government decided to keep the 10% luxury tax on electric vehicles as opposed to granting an exception, which from my perspective makes no sense and is completely inconsistent with the government's desire to get as many EVs on the road as possible. There are lots of opportunities in terms of final thoughts, but Canada needs to act fast to capitalize on virtually all of these opportunities. Opportunities with really require a comprehensive plan, and without that, they can be easily lost. And we need to keep our eye on the prize or prizes as well, which, going back, I think, to my second or third slide, the 3 circles. And from our perspective, the ultimate prize should be greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And we have to consider economic development and also technology deployment as well. I think to achieve success, we have to ensure that all the dominoes align and fall the right way, which is an increasing challenge. And I think there are so many variables right now that are, we could maybe deal with 1 or 2 or 3 of them, but so many different variables right now that, not to be pessimistic, but I think, the goal of making our emissions reduction targets and our zero emission vehicle targets just that much more difficult. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Tim, and happy to try and answer any questions that may come along.
Thank you very much, David. Well, you certainly raise a lot of cautionary flags, I guess I would say. I think I appreciate your effort to try and keep it balanced, because with all the good, we tend to see all the good when we're EV enthusiasts, but there are some realities that need to be dealt with. I think there are some opportunities, though, that I don't know some of the studies you referred to, and I'm going to look into, like, the RBC study as an example. I don't know when they looked at the electricity grid, whether they factored in technological advances in load management capabilities and the ability to spread that out. Maybe we don't need quite as much as they show in that kind of linear progression. Quickly, lithium, I totally get that demand has caused price to go through the roof. And so we're seeing other chemistries like iron phosphate batteries taking their place and turning out in some respects to have advantages over lithium and cost much less.
Really
so
cheaper,
I want to see the glass half full, not half empty. So I'm going to go down those paths, but it's not about what I think. It's let's hear from some of our viewers. And Jason, can I pass this over to you?
No problem. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, David. First question is charging related. The lack of public level 3 charging in half of Manitoba is a huge hindrance to adoption and purchase. How do we get provincial governments on board?
It's a good question. I think it's one that that everybody wrestles with in terms of who should pay for the installation of charging infrastructure, whether it's it's level 2 or level 3, whether it's in a MURB or wherever, that is always the inevitable question is who should pay and how do you get it onboarded? I think one of the challenges is that, and others on the phone, I'm sure on the line may know far more about this than I do, but I think the challenge is being able to make money with the charging infrastructure, and it takes a long time to put level 3 charging structures in place, and they cost a lot of money. They're, it may be a bit off, but I think they're about 100,000 plus to install a level 3 charging. And right now, there's not an opportunity to earn a return or a real return on that. And I think that's why, for instance, you've seen the Canadian Infrastructure Bank step in to try and mitigate some of these challenges. So try and assist those that are interested in putting in scale pieces of charging infrastructure by fronting them the money to do so up front and taking some of the revenue from the actual utilization of the charging infrastructure. But I guess all I can say is that I think it's something that we need to continue to lobby provincial authorities and federal authorities on. Some folks will say, well, shouldn't the automakers themselves be doing this? I think we've taken the position that we've got enough challenges just getting the vehicles on the road. And when you look at ICE vehicles, manufacturers weren't responsible for putting that infrastructure in place. So when we see a business case for it, I think you'll see a lot more infrastructure start to be put in place.
Great, thank you. I think you actually took care of 2 questions in one go there. Next one is, David, would you agree that another key ingredient for success for electrifying our Canadian fleet is the government walking the walk? Shouldn't the government fleets all be electrified by now to show that they're serious about this transition?
Yes, it's a simple answer. But I mean, I think you're dead on. I mean, I think when you look at whether it's a federal government or provincial governments or even municipal governments that have guidelines or rules that they're to follow to purchase EVs or ZEVs. Part of the challenge is that there's always a caveat that where applicable use permits kind of thing, and it's like, well, that's I mean, I don't think you would tell that to consumers. Well, we're going to require you to buy an EV by 2035 unless applicable use doesn't permit that. So I think I would agree that yes, governments should be doing more to walk the walk and as well as talk the talk about the shift. And I think the more we can get zero emission vehicles in any kind of fleet where there's some public exposure to them, also generates more interest and to a certain degree less concern about zero emission vehicles from the consumer perspective as well.
Excellent. Another question, this one's about education, and we hear this quite a bit. With many average Canadians not aware or educated enough on EVs, education is an important factor for adoption. What are the things that your members are doing to help educate and promote EVs to consumers at dealerships when they walk into the showroom?
Yeah, it's a good question. Each of my member companies has their own initiatives that they're undertaking with respect to not only, and let's look at education broadly. I think we look at it from the perspective of, certainly educating their own staff in terms of the product that they have in the marketplace, but then also competitive vehicles that their EV or EV models might compete against. But in terms of consumer education, I think our view has been that the government certainly has a role to play there in terms of more of the generalized consumer education. And Natural Resources Canada, while I don't believe they have any dedicated money for consumer awareness, I think we've been hammering on them, and it's not been lost on them that this is essential, and they have undertaken some awareness initiatives. But what we've been asking is for one simple spreadsheet or website, whatever, of the various EV awareness initiatives that are being undertaken. What they're attempting to do and what the outcome has been. But I think you're right. There's a lot of consumers that that are unaware of the technology, and because they're unaware, it makes them perhaps less willing to entertain purchasing a zero emission vehicle.
Okay.
I have to jump in just for a second, because one of the other points that you made, David, earlier on in, I forget which study, about the charging concerns, not being enough chargers out there, being on people's minds. I totally believe that's what would show up in a survey, but I suspect if you asked a lot of EV owners, they wouldn't say that that was like a critical thing. Yes, undeniably more charging is needed, but people who don't own and live with EVs tend to think that it's not a good time because there aren't enough chargers, not realizing the experience of, I know you can't do it, but charging at home and what that means to refueling that vehicle. So
Sure.
that's an educational thing, and that's what EV Society tries to do. So sorry to interrupt.
No, it's a good point, Tim, because I think Tesla's not one of our members, but I think if people are driving Teslas, their experience in charging is probably completely different from anybody else, because Tesla's had to make that vehicle charging infrastructure seamless and always work 100% of the time. I'm not sure if that's exactly the case with Teslas, but I think the experience is certainly better than with other chargers. And I guess I'm not sure if it's so much, it's not range anxiety anymore with vehicles. I think from my perspective, it really does come down to charging anxiety, to the extent that if I want to be able to use my EV in the same way that I use my ICE vehicle, and that's going up to the cottage and whatever, and driving, across, if I'm for business, if I'm going from Toronto to Ottawa, I want to be able to do that in there might be some compromises, but as few compromises as possible in terms of time that it takes me to charge, availability to charge, those types of things.
Fair enough.
Okay, here's a more supply chain question, I guess. How can we get more battery manufacturers to produce EV batteries in Canada?
That's a great question. And I think if you look at, our innovation, our industry minister, Francois Philippe Champagne, he's been on the road, I think, for the last year, traveling to the Middle East, traveling to Europe for that very reason, to try and persuade vehicle manufacturers that Canada really does have, significant advantages in terms of being able to produce batteries. We've talked a little bit about the mines. I think we've got, as some call it, law of order and good governance in Canada. We're not a despotic nation that is using child labor to mine particular elements, those types of things. So that, and then I would refer back to my slide that highlighted the high integration of the clusters, the various clusters in Ontario as well. And I think we've got a highly educated workforce that certainly tips the scale in favor of Canada, but investors need to know about Canada, need to know about Canada's capabilities. And then I think the other factor is that they have to have some, they're not just going to build batteries for battery's sake. They have to have some linkage to a vehicle manufacturer, which is the importance of being close to the 5 vehicle manufacturers in Ontario, and should say bus manufacturers in Quebec as well, and also the vehicle manufacturing community in the northeastern United States, or Midwest United States, I suppose.
Okay, thank you. This one is a bit of a departure from your material, but maybe you'll want to weigh in. What isn't explored here is the long-term economic and social costs of failure to transition to EVs in a timely fashion. Could you address that briefly?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's it's existential for the automotive industry. If we don't make the transition, and some might argue how fast that should or shouldn't be, but we need to have a market to sell the vehicles to, and if you take the market for granted, then we need to ensure that we're producing the right vehicles for the market. I think if we're producing ICE vehicles into the future, then that has a limited time horizon, and that time horizon is 2035, if not before. So I think it's important for the hundreds of thousands of workers in the automotive industry and the supplier community, the vehicle manufacturing industry, the supplier community, to make this transition, because I think failure to do so will ultimately mean that we would lose our automotive industry and the supply base that goes with it as well. So I think our industry leaders, our government leaders in Canada are all, I think, seized with that objective. And if you look at the 5 manufacturers, they've each made their own investments with provincial and federal government to at least start down that transition to electrified vehicles. Some may take issue with, I've had a number of discussions about Honda. People sort of poo-pooing the announcement about Honda they're just going to produce hybrids. That's yesterday's technology. It doesn't matter. Well, I think in our view, if you keep the real prize GHG emission reductions in sight, you can put everybody in a hybrid, and not to be a shill for Toyota, but you put everybody in a hybrid and you would automatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% or so. So there's real risks, I think, in not making the transition. And I think there's also real risks in not doing the transition that we need to do right, and which sort of harkens back to making sure that all the dominoes align and they fall the right way, as I had, I think, in one of my last slides.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one that's interesting. Could you share your thoughts about EVs and the electrical grid's resiliency, given the recent hurricane news or events like the 2003 blackout?
Sure. Yeah, well, I think you also need to look at more recently California, and California sort of not requiring, but I guess asking citizens to dial back on their energy usage so they didn't exceed the limits of the grid fairly recently, which they did. But I mean, I think grid capacity growth and grid resiliency are going to be two things that are very important going forward. And I think from a grid resiliency perspective, EVs have the potential to, participate actively in that grid resiliency, because I think when you get bidirectional flow into the grid from EVs, which is, not here yet, but is anticipated to be forthcoming in the very near future, then in a way you have a lot of onboard electricity supply in EV vehicles that can be tapped when there is a desperate need to do so. I don't think you want to get into a situation where that's the case all the time. I don't know that EV owners would appreciate that, but certainly it provides that opportunity for sure.
I'd certainly second that. We're seeing more and more vehicles that can do vehicle to grid and vehicle to load, and we're seeing more interest in it from consumers. And the other thing, of course, that you have to remember is in a blackout, the gas stations don't have power either.
Yeah.
So given the choice, I'd rather be driving an EV. Okay, Tim, I think probably one more.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, back to minerals. I expect that at least some of the critical minerals that you showed in your presentation may be replaced by more plentiful options in the future. Thus, looking at the current mix of critical minerals may paint too grim a picture. Are there credible new battery solutions that we should be keeping our eyes on?
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at a lot of the new battery development, iron phosphate batteries that Tim alluded to. I think are one option that don't use cobalt, for instance, and I think there's that's another opportunity and a challenge. There's opportunity to really advance battery technology, but the challenge is, as I mentioned, if we're trying to sort of forecast battery supply and what we need to build based on the technology today, we may find ourselves building mines or redeveloping mines, to no end. But certainly, I think solid state batteries hold out a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of work that's being done there, but it's this the challenge between working with what you have and working with the what's next too. And I think that's the rub that kind of has us sort of all caught up at the moment in terms of just one of the more or the additional factors that need to be carefully reviewed with due diligence as we move forward.
Great,
Okay,
great.
thank you. Tim, back to you.
Thanks so much, Jason. And great segue. I'm going to do a plug for our December episode. We have scheduled somebody who will be addressing mining sustainably for materials for electric vehicles. So that will be of interest to anybody that's keen on that subject. David, thanks so much. This is terrific. I really appreciate it. Sometimes it's not always news you want to hear, but I think you raised some good points. I think I want to believe there are solutions that will come along. And as you say, we want things to happen faster than probably they will. And right. The manufacturers, maybe they're on the other side of that coin. But regardless, we all, as you say, have our eyes on the prize. We all know what it is we're trying to do. As an EV owner, I think they're just better in every way, just the whole driving experience. Even if it wasn't a part of the solution to our climate concerns, I would be on my soapbox telling all my friends, you got to get an EV. Driving right. them is unbelievable. So it's all good. We're going to get there. Hold hands and we'll get there together one way or the other. And on behalf of the society, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great. So next month on Canada Talks Electric Cars, we have a timely episode planned that'll focus on preparing your electric vehicle for winter driving. Joining us to discuss that topic will be Dave Giles from All EV Canada. Dave is a mechanic who specializes in electric vehicles and holds certifications in several areas of advanced vehicle technology. He'll address the impact that cold weather has on your vehicle and the battery and provide some helpful instruction and insights to get us all through the coming winter. Be sure to mark the date. It's October 4th. Sorry, I've got the wrong date on there. It's November, and I'm going to have to say it's the first Tuesday in November. I don't have my calendar out. And we hope that we'll see you there, 7:30 Eastern Standard Time as usual. So thank you all for joining us on today's episode. We very much appreciate your support of our webinar, and we thank you for spending this time with us. So from all of us at Electric Vehicle Society, and until next time, stay well. This will conclude today's episode.